reach across through it.
All right, I can't actually see how many participants are on now. I've lost my participant screen.
Right.
Let me just check up here. There we go. I can see now. Just give it a couple of minutes for people to join. People are probably still making their coffees.
I haven't had one this morning.
Oh, that's terrible news. So we're up to 56 participants. I'm going to let it cross 100 and then I think we'll get started.
We should probably wait till 9 too. My clock's late.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, I think my clock's a little fast. All right. All right, that's 9 o'clock. I think we should get started. So just get rid of that. Well, tēnā koutou katoa, no mai, haere mai. My name's Daimhin Warner and I'm Principal and Director at Simply Privacy. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. This webinar is brought to you for Privacy Week, an initiative supported by the Privacy Commissioner to promote the discussion of privacy. Kia ora to the OPC for pulling these events together. But just to clarify, this presentation is independent of the Privacy Commissioner and the views expressed are personal to us, the speakers. As the regulator, the Privacy Commissioner may have different views to those expressed in this presentation. This morning, it's my absolute privilege to be sitting down with my friend and colleague, Frith Tweedie, to get this conversation started on AI and privacy. Frith is a principal at Simply Privacy, working alongside myself and a few others, and has extensive experience advising on privacy issues in the tech space, including the legal and ethical implications of AI. Back in 2020, Frith drafted the Trustworthy AI in Aotearoa Ethical Principles for the AI Forum. She advised on the development of the National AI Strategy and Ethics Framework for the Government of Malta while leading the New Zealand and Australian digital law practice for EY. She then went on to set up a responsible AI framework for Aura, while also serving as their General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer. At present, she's helping Stats New Zealand operationalise the AI Charter for government agencies. And from a governance perspective, no less achieved, she's the IAPP Advisory Board member for IAPP, along with myself. and the executive committee, and she's on the executive committee of the AI Forum, and served on the governance committee for the New Zealand Algorithm Hub, which is a government-funded initiative to help develop data models to support New Zealand's COVID-19 response. So strong experience and background on the topic, and I think we're going to get some really great information from Frith today. And without a doubt, artificial intelligence, machine learning, algorithms, and automated decision-making have all dominated the privacy discourse for some time. The launch of generative AI tools and the significant regulator responses to these tools around the world have only heightened this concern. It's for this reason that so many of the virtual sessions on offer this week, in fact, touch on AI. And our intention for today is to set everyone up for a week of in-depth sessions on the topic. We hope to provide a good overview of how current privacy laws apply to AI, what regulators and lawmakers are planning to do to better regulate AI in the future, and what we can all do to stay within the guardrails in the meantime. If any questions come to mind during our rambling, but hopefully very interesting discussion, please pop them in the Q&A. Don't use the chat, and don't use the hand raiser either, because we're going to try and keep on track just because there's so many sessions that are happening this week. Please, as always, turn off your video, mute yourself. And if you want to make it easier to see only the two of us while we're speaking, go to View in the top right-hand corner of your screen and select Hide Non-Video Participants. All right, so that's all the housekeeping done. I think let's get started on the substance. So, Frith, turning to you, first of all, can you explain for the uninitiated, which is probably most of us, myself included, what exactly is AI? There seems to be quite a bit of confusion about what it is and what it isn't. And frankly, how does ChatGPT fit in here?
So I really think of AI as an umbrella term that covers key aspects like machine learning, forms of computer vision like facial recognition, natural language processing, so ChatGPT is an example of that, and robotics. I think sometimes people say, oh, you know, machine learning is not AI, and they're thinking about the distinction between general AI and narrow AI. And general AI is really that kind of Terminator, Westworld type vision that has equivalent intelligence to a human, which I hasten to add doesn't exist at this point. And
thank goodness for that.
And it's still a way off. I mean, I think with ChatGPT and the speed at which things are moving there, commentators are starting to raise that spectre again. But the point that I really like to emphasize is that there are more pressing issues with AI that we should be addressing before we start thinking that, you know, the robots are here to take over. So really, we're still talking about narrow AI, machine learning, NLP, etc. And in terms of a definition, the AI Act is looking to use the OECD definition, which is quite long-winded, and I can share it afterwards if anyone's keen. But what I really like is a definition by Reid Blackman, who's the author of a book called Ethical Machines, and he describes it as software that learns by example, and by example, you know, that means data, which I think is a nice, simple way of understanding it.
So I mean, again, for the uninitiated, where do algorithms fit into all of this? You know, what's that element? Does all AI need algorithms?
So yeah, I mean, essentially, you have algorithm plus data equals a model. So the data goes into the algorithm, and there's, you know, varying degrees of complexity, which I won't get into. But yeah, an algorithm doesn't only occur in an AI context. Of course, it's really sort of like a simple way of thinking of it is like a recipe or an instruction to do a set of things. But, you know, from a privacy perspective, the key thing to be aware of is that AI, of course, requires large volumes of data to power it. And where that data is personal information, then privacy issues are likely to arise.
And of course, AI can exist without personal information, right? I mean, there's AI, and then there's AI that sucks in personal information.
Exactly. So the issues with AI are broader than privacy, but of course, where there is personal information, as we all know, that there are particular issues that come up. And there are also issues that arguably sit beyond privacy as we know it and privacy laws, but interact with other laws. So getting into human rights laws, discrimination, intellectual property certainly is a big issue with ChatGPT and other large language models.
Okay, so you're kind of, as you talk there, you're kind of moving into that risk space. So perhaps this is a good time to kind of outline what are some of the key risks that we're talking about when we're looking at AI in the privacy space and possibly beyond too.
Yeah, and you know, a caveat before we kick off into that, you know, as any good AI risk article will always start with a comment that, you know, AI promises great benefit, you know, but there are risks. And absolutely, there are some amazing things that AI can do. And even anyone who's had a play with ChatGPT, it's pretty mind-boggling what it's capable of. This session isn't here to focus on this. This is a session that recognizes that there are some by now pretty established risks, and the big focus here is what can you do what can organizations do to try and manage those risks. So there's going to be, as you said at the beginning, Davin, there's going to be lots of sessions throughout the week on AI. The goal with this one is really to provide some answers and a solution to try and manage those. So, but before we get into that, yeah, as you say, let's run through some of those risks. So a big one is around bias and discrimination. And there are some pretty, I guess, concerning examples where, a tool called Compass has been used by criminal justice systems in the US. And that was designed to predict recidivism. And it was found to be biased against Black people. So Black defendants were more likely than white ones to be incorrectly judged as having a higher risk of reoffending. Many people may have heard of the Amazon AI-powered recruitment tool, which they actually ditched because it was supposed to review CVs and pick out sort of top candidates. But because it had been trained on data from successful applicants over the last 10 years at Amazon, most of those were male. So it actually essentially learned to penalise female applicants. And what was interesting there was that gender wasn't explicitly included. It wasn't presented to the algorithm as a predictive feature, but because it can spot patterns, it was able to start to penalise things like, you know, captain of the women's hockey team and so on. So obviously, you know, that kind of this ability to entrench inequality is quite concerning. And in a similar vein, people might remember the UK A-level scandal that happened in the early-ish days of COVID. So students sitting their A-level exams couldn't sit their exams because of COVID lockdowns. So Ofcom, their Ministry of Education over there, used an algorithm to try and work out what their grades would be. But the algorithm looked at various factors, but one of the factors was what the historical grades of each student's school had been. So if you were a top performing student from a school, say in a low decile area, you would essentially be penalised for that. Whereas if you were sort of a not such a great student going to a private school or in a wealthier area, you would sort of get an uplift from that. So as I say, that entrenching inequality. Other concerns arise in relation to lack of transparency and what's often referred to as a black box. So where people actually don't know how the AI tool has produced the result that it has, and obvious problems there when you get into needing to challenge decisions that may have been made about you, whether it's sort of IRD or MSD or you know, a bank or whatever. And Apple Card actually had an issue along these lines. This was Apple getting into the financial services market. The card was backed by Goldman Sachs, and it hit the headlines after someone tweeted that their wife had received a much lower credit limit on her card than the husband had, despite her having actually overall a higher credit score than he did. So there was, and then Steve Wozniak of early Apple fame kind of tweeted a similar thing. And eventually there was a formal investigation into it that concluded that there was no discrimination. But actually I was reading an interesting piece recently that said that part of the problem with the review, the investigation, was the methodology that was adopted and sort of outdated laws on discrimination. So in that instance, race, gender, marital status weren't data inputs, but the review didn't take account of what's known as data proxies. So this is where there can be features that correlate with certain characteristics. So you might not, say, for example, have ethnicity in data, but if you are able to tell where someone lives, then sometimes that can be correlated. So just stripping out those sensitive data features is not always the answer. The interesting one with that one is, so this is where there was a black box. It was unclear exactly how the algorithm would produce these results. But Apple's pretty good. They understand the value of trust, as we've seen from their approach to privacy. So Tim Cook came out and said that there had been a lack of fairness in the way the credit scores were calculated, and so they announced that they'd updated their credit policy. So I think that's an interesting example, because it shows that even though no discrimination was found, it still can be very damaging for an organisation to be sort of pulled into the glare of the headlights. And then Apple layering over the top that they took those issues seriously and they tried to address them to try and manage those reputation risks.
Especially given that Apple's not a data company, Frith, or it doesn't put itself forward as a data company, which was how it was able to do the tracking functionality, or the don't track functionality. And so that's an interesting case, because I mean, it reminds us that actually Apple does collect personal information and falls into the same traps as bigger data organizations.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's certainly been criticism of their stance, that they're not as perhaps squeaky clean as they might always suggest. In terms of risks, so we've talked about data, and certainly there can be historic data like we saw with Amazon that can perpetuate bias, but there can also be problems with the way the algorithm performs. And there are a couple of horrifying examples, actually, both to do with childcare benefits, one in the Netherlands and one in Australia with robo-debt. So it was a couple of years ago in the Netherlands, the Dutch tax authorities had used an algorithm to help identify childcare benefit fraud. And it used, I think they created risk profiles that were based on certain risk indicators, such as having dual nationality and a low income. And so it ended up that more than 20,000 families were wrongly accused of benefit fraud, and something like 10,000 families were forced to repay tens of thousands of euros. And in some cases that led to unemployment and bankruptcies and divorces. But even worse, several people actually committed suicide, and more than 1,000 children were taken into foster care. So just horrific consequences. The Dutch privacy regulator issued some pretty hefty fines for GDPR breaches, and ultimately the Dutch government resigned because of this kind of claims of systemic racism in the approach. So absolutely horrendous. I'm not sure why they didn't get more airtime over here. Got a bit more coverage, but still not a huge amount. So this is similarly Centrelink, which provides social security payments in Australia. I believe it's part of their equivalent to the Ministry of Social Development here. So from 2016 to 2019, they were raising inaccurate debts essentially through a method of income averaging, which has since been ruled unlawful. So debts were unfairly imposed on people, but the people then had to prove that they didn't owe the money. So there's been a royal commission into it, and again, lots of awful stories of financial suffering, mental health impact, Two mothers said their sons had taken their own lives, including one who was hounded over an unlawful debt of $17,000. So in 2021, a federal court judge approved a settlement of $1.8 billion for people wrongly pursued by this robo-debt scheme. And so what happened was it was an automated debt assessment and recovery program, and it relied solely on a data matching system to issue these debt notices. And apparently it used quite a simple algorithm that drew on data from the Centrelink records and the Australian Tax Office. But they recorded their data in slightly different formats. I think Centrelink used fortnightly figures and the ATO used annual income data. So that seems to have created some problems. And exaggerated and false inflation of the debt. I'm sure there are other factors as well, but that was sort of one of the simpler ones that stood out. And I think these next points are relevant to what we're going to be looking at a little bit later with responsible AI. There was limited human oversight and a lack of governance or best practice was found. So there wasn't much testing or piloting during implementation. And actually, it's interesting that Centrelink was criticised for not involving relevant stakeholders, including legal experts and what were described as domain specialists in the development of the scheme. So this kind of, no one really kind of taking the big picture. And I understand there were various sort of political pressures at play as well.
Yeah. So are there any, Frith, those are good examples and they're really quite shocking. Are there any closer to home? Are there any New Zealand examples of this happening? Or are we just squeaky clean?
Oh, no, we're perfect. Well, the ACC faced some controversy, I think a couple of years ago. They were using a computer model to target how long clients were on its books, and then sorting and targeting them according to who it considered a risk. And that was criticised for a lack of transparency, and questions were raised about whether, similar to Centrelink, whether there were appropriate checks and balances in place, whether there was legal oversight, and questions around transparency and consent. So there's certainly real issues in New Zealand as well.
Did ACC stop using its algorithm because of that?
I don't actually know the answer to that. I don't know if anyone on the call might know, or if you're aware of that, Davin.
I'm not. Pop it in the Q&A, folks, if anyone knows what happened with the ACC one.
So those are, and it's just worth pointing out that what I've just described there are some of the risks associated with AI generally. Obviously, the world's gone crazy getting worked up about ChatGPT, and
sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you, Frith. Lisa Russell, who is from ACC, thank you so much, Lisa.
Oh, awesome.
She says, I believe we did. So
okay,
awesome.
Good.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa. So yeah, I was just saying that everyone's focused on ChatGPT at the moment, but I'd really like to emphasize that we shouldn't be forgetting about the wider risks. It's not all about ChatGPT. ChatGPT brings some particular issues into focus, certainly some big issues around things like IP, deep fakes, misinformation, potential for fraud, that kind of thing, which are all very concerning. But I think we also, a lot of the conversation, a lot of the discussion online is focused on OpenAI, so that, who've developed ChatGPT, and Microsoft has obviously invested heavily. We need to sort of, I think, distinguish between what OpenAI is doing and what the big tech companies are doing when they're putting out these large language models, and what organizations, in New Zealand, for example, should be thinking about. So, because, when it comes to ChatGPT, you don't want to be putting personal or confidential information into those tools unless there is now a setting where you can turn off that information being used to continue training the model, and there are sort of more secure private APIs coming with ChatGPT Business. But until those things are available, you definitely shouldn't be putting personal information in. But some of those other issues around perhaps misinformation and so on are arguably less relevant to a New Zealand organisation looking at what it should be doing with AI.
Just quickly, Frith, would you mind, and don't worry if you don't have time for this now, but could you, for dummies like me, explain what a large language model means very basically? What is that?
So it's essentially trained on just phenomenal quantities of data. And I'm not a data scientist, but as I understand it, the data goes into the model, and the model essentially expresses these statistical relationships between words and their context. So the data, the words in the data, so scraped from the internet, actually gets turned into numbers, and then the model does this relationship. And the contextual bit is really really important to understand, because what ChatGPT and other large language models are producing is like, it has no understanding of what it's saying. It's essentially predicting what words it thinks make sense around the other words. So it's almost like an incredibly sophisticated predictive text, like, you know, when you're texting on your phone, but just way better than that. So that's why they do have a tendency to hallucinate and just make stuff up, which doesn't make any sense. And that's why when people are using ChatGPT, particularly in a business context, they really need to be very carefully fact checking what they're producing. I think anyone who's used it to produce any material of which they have any understanding themselves, you can pretty quickly see it. It tends to be fairly superficial, and it does kind of come up with some random stuff that shouldn't be relied upon. But of course, that creates all sorts of concerns when it comes to things like misinformation and disinformation. And these tools getting into the wrong hands can be quite terrifying, really.
Yeah, okay. Oh, that was so helpful. Thank you. I hope there's other people in the audience who needed that explanation like I did, but I really appreciate it.
Do you want, I mean, there's probably a couple of other risks that I could go through, or do we want to?
Well, here's the thing, you talked about the hallucinations, but probably, you know, and these other risks you've talked about around misinformation and disinformation are really, really interesting to me and quite new to me. But what about the old basic? What about security risks? How does sort of these types of generative AI models impact on security?
Yeah, definitely. Cyber criminals are apparently finding ChatGPT pretty attractive, because you can use it to write code. So apparently there is certainly evidence already of hackers using it to write malicious code, and using it to really speed up the process. So yeah, I'd say watch this space. There'll be some horrifying stories to come, probably.
Yeah, okay. All right, so digging into this a bit more then, and in terms of, so we've talked a bit about the sort of the whole basket of risks, and it's huge, and they're wide ranging and some quite unknown, you know, to us, or we're really starting to learn about them. But if we were to sort of filter it down to the core privacy risks, what do they look like? And let's start considering, what does our current law say? Is there any help here already?
Yeah, so as we discussed before, obviously need lots of data to power AI, and where that's personal information, you know, we're clearly in the realms of privacy considerations. So data breaches are obviously an obvious one. If you are using an AI tool and you've got lots of personal information, then you know you need to be making sure that that's securely protected, etc. On the collection side of things, you're making sure that you're complying with the relevant IPPs in that regard. I mean, obviously in Europe with GDPR, they're getting into issues of consent, which don't come up in quite the same way in New Zealand. But transparency is definitely an issue. Being transparent about when you're using AI tools, if you're using customer-facing chatbots and so on, when you're collecting information that will be used in AI tools. So thinking about whether you need to update your privacy policies to reflect what you might be doing with AI. Certainly Clearview AI ran into problems with a bunch of regulators around the world around a lack of transparency in terms of what they were doing with personal.
I remember that one.
And ChatGPT has been facing similar issues. So the Garante, the Italian privacy regulator, the temporary ban on OpenAI and ChatGPT for a period of time. It's now lifted that because OpenAI sprang into action and finally came up with a privacy policy and changed some of their settings and so on, which I think I posted on LinkedIn. You know, if they'd adopted a privacy by design approach from the outset, they would have had these things in place. So, you know, and this is what we've seen, is this sort of race possibly to the bottom at the moment between certainly OpenAI and Microsoft and Google around, you know, getting kind of, you know, that first leader advantage and, you know, staking that claim. And so there are concerns that because they're just racing, everyone's racing to improve their technology, they're not necessarily thinking about the wider implications.
So is current, I mean, Frith, is current law up to the game here? You know, what are we thinking? Would it be enough to say, look, don't worry about this, we've got a Privacy Act, or don't worry about this, we've got the GDPR?
I mean, those laws certainly weren't developed with the likes of large language models in mind, and I think they go some of the way, but I don't think that they're the complete answer. I mean, there are a whole bunch of issues that come up. As I've said, there's intellectual property infringements, there's bias and discrimination. So there are other laws, but you know, regulation never can move at the speed of technology. So this is why the Europe's response is the AI Act, which is working through the various European processes at the moment, but people seem to be saying possibly end of this year, probably more likely sometime next year that would be enacted, although I imagine, like GDPR, it probably wouldn't actually take effect until perhaps a couple of years later. But that takes a risk-based approach to AI. It bans certain high-risk forms of AI, like social scoring and sort of, you know, kind of extreme manipulation. And then for what's considered high-risk forms of AI, there's a whole bunch of measures that need to be undertaken. So my pick is that, much like we saw with GDPR, that's very likely to have a global impact. I tend to call it the GDPR trickle-down effect, where, you know, other jurisdictions around the world have sort of borrowed quite a few elements from GDPR and introduced those into their laws. You know, I've seen that in California, for example, seen that in Australia. I'm sure it will be the same with the AI Act, because just like GDPR, it will have extraterritorial effect. So if you have business dealings in Europe, then you will be subject to it. So it's still, you know, we don't have the final text of it yet, but it's very much watch this space. My view is that regulation is definitely coming, and we're seeing a lot of discussion about this everywhere. There is China recently released some draft regulations. There've been various bills that have gone through in the US. None of them have made it through yet, but Senator Chuck Schumer, such a great American name, he seems to be taking the lead at the moment in the US. And of course, GDPR has got some provisions around automated decision making. So they're already sort of addressing some of that. There's also been some really interesting decisions. I mean, the OAIC in Australia a year or two ago, they issued some really interesting decisions on Clearview AI and 7-Eleven using facial recognition, which are really worth a read. Some really good analysis of concepts like necessity and proportionality, which are just as relevant in a New Zealand context. And certainly, you know, as we get ready for most likely a biometrics code of practice. I think those are two really informative decisions. And when it comes to proportionality, this is thinking about, well, so what happened in 7-Eleven is they were essentially wanting to capture customer feedback in stores. So they had some kind of tablet device that I think you filled in a survey and it captured your image. And they wanted to capture the image because they were concerned that their employees might try and game the system if they didn't. So capturing this really sensitive personal information for really a not wildly important tool. So it was held that that wasn't proportionate use of a particularly invasive technology.
Okay. All right. So, I mean, what I'm kind of hearing from you is that, you know, we've got kind of some laws in place today. They're not entirely perfect for the job. They're not up to it. There are going to be a lot of risks that aren't properly regulated in those current privacy laws or other laws. We're also looking at regulators contemplating new things in this space. You know, AI Act probably being the biggest one. I guess, as you've said, we've also got other laws, you know, that can cover some of these other things around IP, human rights, etc. But it seems as though, and someone asked this question just now, Cheryl, thanks for that. It seems as though there is space in this growing risk area for organizations to take a little bit of a front foot and start doing something about this, developing their own policies and procedures to manage the risk themselves. And this to me sounds like the way to go. I mean, you know, as privacy professionals, we do this all the time for privacy because privacy laws need a bit of help. And then the question becomes, how do we do this? And, you know, one thing I notice, not just this year, but previous years too, there's been a lot of talk about this concept of AI ethics. But the trouble I have with that is that ethics are subjective. And so, you know, if you're trying to set rules for your organization based on ethics alone, how do you do that? How do you, you know, is there any issue with using this generic notion of ethics to measure AI risk?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we've seen a bit of a development over the last few years. I mean, when I first started getting involved in this space in about 2018, it was very much the discussion was around AI ethics. And over the last few years, it's moved much more towards, we had the EU talking about trustworthy AI and various companies talking about trusted AI, and it's moved more towards thinking about it as responsible AI. So rather than sort of, you know, as you've said, potentially sort of subjective and kind of intangible notions of ethics and sort of morality and so on, it's more about thinking, well, what are the impacts of our actions and how can we be sure that we are taking the appropriate steps to manage the risks that are now pretty well established and pretty well known. So we saw around 2018, 2019, 1,000,001 sets of AI ethical principles come out. So, you know, as you said in the intro AI forum, Trustworthy AI in Aotearoa, we kind of felt there wasn't a New Zealand version out yet. So we pulled that one together. The government, of course, released the Algorithm Charter, which quite a large number of government agencies have signed up to. And those ethical principles are all great, and they're a good sort of North Star, but they're by necessity very high level, and they're really difficult to actually know what you need to do on the ground. You know, if one of the principles is fairness or, you know, transparency, it's not telling, you know, day-to-day data scientists and others what they should be doing. So there is a real need to operationalize those principles within a wider framework in AI governance. And as you've said, Devin, there are huge parallels with a good privacy program. So when I'm advising clients on, you know, a responsible AI framework, a lot of the same things come up. So, you know, get your senior leadership on board. That tone from the top is really key. Have your risk management processes in place, have a clear strategy, you know, have some form of impact assessment. So what's emerging is this idea of an algorithmic impact assessment, which is in many respects quite
Mhm.
similar to a privacy impact assessment. And the idea is that, much like a PIA, you do this really early, ideally in the sort of design stage, when you can get an understanding of what data is being used to train your model. Where does it come from? Is it representative of the populations that it's going to be applied to? And this particularly comes to the fore when you're looking at procuring in third-party AI tools that may have been trained using data from, say, North America. How is that going to deal with New Zealand populations? And is it going to, exhibit potential bias when it doesn't recognise, Māori, Pacifica, different kind of demographics to what you might find in the US or China, for that matter.
Yeah.
So that's on the data side. Then it's like, how is that algorithm performing? What monitoring is in place, and tying that all into, well, what is the business purpose here? What is the value proposition of using this technology? And are we achieving that through what we're proposing to do? So, yeah, I really encourage organizations to adopt what by and large most people are calling a responsible AI framework. And the way I look at it is that it has sort of 4 key pillars essentially. So the strategy piece, what AI do we want to use? Why are we using it? What are we hoping to achieve? What's the sort of broader regulatory environment? What are some of the overall risks? Having good governance in place. So, making sure that you've got someone at an executive level with some responsibility and accountability. A lot of organizations will have some kind of review board or steering group, or, and that ideally has people from a range of disciplines. So I think it's important to note that AI is different from just standard technology and IT. It's not something that just is the domain of IT professionals, because it has, as some of the literature says, these socio-technical implications. So essentially it has this big impact on people. So for a governance board, you'd want certainly your data scientists and your technology people, but you'd probably also want your legal team, possibly certainly some of your public relations team, a good cross-section of people, and certainly privacy people. I think there's an opportunity here for privacy people to bring their knowledge of the privacy world and their understanding of risk management to bear in this space.
It's important. I just to stop you there. I think that's a really good point, that I think there's going to be a tendency to put AI risk squarely on privacy roles within an organization. But I feel like one of the things that your discussion today has shown me is that the risks are so much broader than privacy. Privacy are definitely key risks, but it's not the only risk. And so we can't rely solely on our privacy officers, our privacy functions to manage AI risk. So I think your thought around that broader governance piece seems to me across agency, cross collaboration, seems to be absolutely critical here.
And let's be honest, I mean, how many privacy teams are sort of overstaffed? I mean, generally privacy teams do a lot with not much, and putting all of this on top of them as well is probably an extra burden. So much like any good privacy program, you need that. You need the senior execs to understand the issues and to be prepared to invest in this. And I guess the value proposition of all of this is maintaining and ideally developing trust, because if you do this badly and you get dragged into the news or before regulators, it's going to be incredibly damaging. So a responsible AI approach is really about maximizing the benefits of AI and organizations' investment in AI, but really minimizing the potential risks to make sure that you've got that trust.
So on that, that's so having outlined kind of the key pillars of a program, I'm pretty sure a lot of people on this call, on this webinar, will be thinking, yeah, but how on earth do we start implementing such a thing? I mean, from your experience, what will help us to implement these responsible AI programs or frameworks?
Yeah, so those four sort of pillars: strategy, governance, principles, and then what I call operationalization, which isn't the catchiest word. I perhaps need to come up with something that's easier to get off the tongue. That last bit, the operationalization piece.
Let's call it the
action. The action, yeah, I like that. That is tough. I think this is where algorithmic impact assessments really come into play. It's a kind of methodical way of going through and identifying what the risks might be, what potential unintended consequences might be, and that enables you to identify appropriate mitigants or controls. So I've drafted a couple of AIAs now, and there, in terms of the process that sits around it, there's a paper piece, but you can kind of speed up the process and make it a bit more collaborative by kicking off with an initial workshop with all the key internal stakeholders. We can sort of brainstorm, why are we wanting to use this technology? What's the problem we're trying to solve? How will this help? What are some of the potential risks? What are some of the potential controls? And just getting all that thinking going. And then you have typically an AIA questionnaire that's completed, but then a really critical piece is, well, who actually reviews that questionnaire and who is able to really identify and clearly articulate what the risks and what the controls might be? Because as probably many of us know on this call, sometimes, if you've got people in the business filling out a PIA, they don't necessarily always understand, what the privacy issues might be. And so a privacy team reviewing that will have to do some more work to really pull out what the issues and risks are, and certainly what the controls might be. So in a similar vein here, you do need people with some understanding of what the risks are to do that review piece. And similar to a PIA, having a report that comes out at the end that, ideally is nice and short, nails what those key risks are, and then that is used to inform, senior level decision making, emphasizing throughout all of this that you really want to be taking a risk-based approach. If you're using AI, I don't know, maybe in, say, an agricultural context, and it's to do with horticulture or something, there's no people involved per se, then you don't need to be doing all of this. But if you are doing something that is really making decisions that impact people, then you want to be, taking this more seriously.
Yeah.
And just like with a good privacy program, we often talk, Daimhin, about privacy by design, taking whatever you want to call it, a responsible AI by design, ethics by design, thinking about these things up front. So there's definitely an education piece within organizations and raising awareness.
That's good. Yeah, those are good thoughts. And actually, we've got a few questions here, Frith, from people asking you to sum up the 4 pillars that you talked about. So can you recap again on what those 4 pillars of the responsible AI framework should be?
So an AI strategy, that's probably where your data scientists and data teams will come to the fore around, the value proposition. Why do you want to do this? What problems are you trying to solve? That's pillar 1. Pillar 2 is the governance piece. So roles and responsibilities, risk management frameworks, all the usual sort of good stuff that goes around governance. A set of principles, ideally tailored to your organization. There've been so many of them now, they're all fairly standardized. But
there's a lot of good examples to pull from, isn't there?
Yeah. A good starting point is probably the AI Forum version, because that does recognize a New Zealand context. But if you can align those to your corporate strategy, even better, because then it really makes them resonate within your organization. And then the 4th one is is how do you go about bringing that to life? How do you operationalize it? So we've talked about AIAs in that context, but you also want to have your good underpinnings, your good data governance. You're going to struggle to do AI well if your data governance is a mess, and similarly, your privacy underpinnings as well. Human oversight, I guess, comes in under both sort of governance and the action side of things, making sure that, and your risk management, making sure that you're keeping an eye on your AI tools throughout the life cycle, and have various stage gates when you're checking what it's producing and that it isn't going haywire. And vendor due diligence, touched on earlier, that's a reasonably challenging area. I think probably a lot of organizations will be buying in tools, but the challenges arise there around understanding the training data, for example, because often, certain big tech companies and so on are reluctant to share that information. And increasingly, particularly overseas, these issues are well understood in terms of trust and so on. So often they'll be like, yeah, we're doing everything great. Look at our responsible AI program, nothing to see here. And, the people who want to buy in the tools and are desperate to get using them may be happy with the sales pitch, but I think a little bit of skepticism is sensible here to, do your due diligence, look behind the sales pitch, understand, how their tool works, where their training data comes from, what security do they have in place, and making sure all of that is backed up in your contracts as well.
Won't there be an issue there, Frith? I see, as privacy professionals, we've long seen, particularly in New Zealand, that we're generally contract takers from these big technology platforms. We have no clout to change contracts. Won't we see in the AI technology space a lack of transparency because it's commercial sensitivity? It's a trade secret how they build their algorithms. And then we're going to have this kind of real, I guess, that information asymmetry. We're going to be deciding on using tech without all the information we need to understand what are the implications, what are the potential outcomes for people if we use this AI, because we have no idea. So we will, absolutely, I presume, see a little bit of that imbalance.
Absolutely, and I've already seen that, and that's why this area is challenging. So I think you do as much as you can, and you push to get as much information as you can. But I think, as you point out, there's going to be a limit probably to what you're going to see. So this means that those measures further down the track around monitoring your algorithm and keeping an eye on how it's performing, finding ways to identify potential potential bias, etc. That becomes even more important, because if you don't know what data the model has been trained on, and whether, for example, there might be inherent bias in that data, then you need to have an even stronger process further down the track to try and pick up on potential issues.
Yeah. So Frith, we've got 5 minutes left or so. I do want to, there's a few good questions popping up in the Q&A. So before we move to the questions from the participants, just to close out your comments, what are your key, your 3 key takeaways around responsible AI? If you were to summarize this session in 3 quick points, what are the ones you want people to walk away with?
So I guess the first one would probably be that yes, there are incredible opportunities associated with AI, but organizations and privacy professionals and the like really need to go in with our eyes open, and with an awareness that there may be risks, because as we've seen with some of those examples we went through earlier, there can be quite devastating consequences. I guess the second point would be that taking a responsible approach to AI development and deployment is really critical to enable an organization to identify and manage potential risks, and of course maintain trust. Without that, organizations are really going to struggle. And then I guess the final point would probably be around timing. much like privacy, don't leave this to the last minute. Don't, wait until the horse is bolted. If your organization is already taking the plunge or is looking at starting to explore AI, then you should be thinking about these issues and starting to pull together an approach, because we all know that it's much harder to kind of fix these things once an issue has arisen. It's much easier to kind of try and head them off from the outset.
Yeah, okay. And privacy by design approach, but actually what we're talking about here is it's not a case by case thing. Do it early. It's before you even start doing algorithm impact assessments, you actually need to have the framework in place. So what you're saying is get that framework in place early. It's not too late, because I think a lot of organizations will find that they're already using an alarming amount of AI and may not even realize it, because the technology that they're using already includes, things like human resources applications and platforms that are using AI constantly to provide sort of learning development opportunities for people and those kinds of things. So,
yeah,
okay.
absolutely. And just to say one thing there, lots of organizations obviously have risk management frameworks in place, and whether that be from a privacy perspective or otherwise. So leverage those existing frameworks. I'm not saying you need to start from scratch. There's a lot that can be, these things can be added on top of.
Yeah, okay. Now, we've only got 2 minutes left. And so there was one question I really liked. That's actually the last question that came through, but I love it. It's from Lisa again at ACC. Thanks, Lisa. And the key question is, are there any AI do not do's, never use? Are there any things that are so significant or sensitive that we can draw a clear line, or is it always going to be case by case? I like that question. What are the what are the don't do's? What are the never do's?
Well, I guess we could take the lead from the EU and the AI Act. So there's, social credit scoring. I think that probably speaks for itself. They're debating at the moment around facial recognition, real-time facial recognition in public places by law enforcement agencies. That's been a hot topic for debate. There are arguments for and against. And then I think the other ones were around sort of online manipulation. And I was reading something this morning around that opportunity to really create hyper-personalized kind of marketing communications that can really influence people to quite an extreme degree. Yeah, not a fan of that. But I think overall it's really, there's so many unknowns in this space. I think you really need to, a good approach is some kind of, a bit like a PIA, a threshold assessment, to try and get a feel for what do we feel the risk might be before you do a full-blown AIA. But it's really that AIA process that helps you draw out the risks and understand them.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you. I think that's quite a good kind of way to end the session, is kind of where are the boundaries? What's the real dark areas that we don't want to touch? So this has been wonderful, Frith. Thank you. I hope you've all, as participants, enjoyed this discussion, kind of kicking off Privacy Week. We're very lucky to have had the opportunity to do this with you all this morning. I certainly enjoyed it. And in terms of what to do next, one thing you can always do is reach out to the wonderful Frith Tweedie, who is available to, for people to sound check, for people to bounce ideas off, for people to check what they're doing is up there. And I think also do watch this space, because Frith's going to be out there doing quite a lot in this space from a governance perspective. As I said before, she's involved with a number of really good initiatives happening at the moment. So she will be one to watch, and I think we're really lucky to have her here. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this morning so early. Have a wonderful Privacy Week. We're going into back-to-back events. So again, kia ora to OPC for organising such an incredible packed session for the week. And really, that's it from us. Mā te wā.
Thanks, everyone.